Namaskar सबैजनालाई. Thank you so much for joining and welcome to the 16th webinar of Nepal Mental Health Research Webinar Series. Today I'll be moderating the webinar session on behalf of our team. So at first I would like to introduce myself. I am Vinita Acharya, currently working as a research officer at TPO Nepal in Research Project. So moving towards the webinar, हजुरहरुले स्क्रिनमा देख्न सक्नुहुनेछ हाम्रो आजको वेबिनारको topic, which is are trauma related disorders rare in Nepal and explorations of PTSD and complex PTSD in trauma victims presenting in psychiatry OPD in tertiary centers of Nepal. And our speaker is Dr. Rishabh Koirala. We will be introducing our speaker later. Before that, there are some reminders and couple of points that I would like to share with you all. So first thing first, हाम्रो यो वेबिनार चाहिँ रेकर्डिङ हुन्छ. हाम्रो यो वेबिनार रेकर्डिङ गर्नुको मेन मोटिभ भनेको चाहिँ हामीले वेबिनारको मेटेरियल्सहरु, यसको स्लाइड्सहरु जस्तो अनि स्पिकरहरुले प्रोवाइड गर्नु भएको आर्टिकल्सहरु चाहिँ हामीले हजुरहरुलाई प्रोवाइड गर्छौं, so that you can see it later and get back to us or share any informations or queries related to it later on also. So we ensure that we have permission for that as well. अनि वेबिनार मेटेरियल्स को लागि चाहिँ हजुरहरुले रेजिस्ट्रेसन फर्म भर्नु भएको छैन भने प्लिज रेजिस्ट्रेसन फर्म भर्दिनु होला. हामीले चाहिँ जसले रेजिस्ट्रेसन फर्म भर्नु भएको छ उहाँहरुलाई नै मेटेरियल्सहरु पठाउने गर्छौं. अनि त्यसपछि यो हाम्रो वेबिनार चाहिँ जुलाई 2021 बाट स्टार्ट भएर चाहिँ अर्ली एन्ड मिड करियर रिसर्चरलाई फोकस गरेर चाहिँ हुँदै आइरहेको छ. सो यसलाई कसरी बेटर गर्न सकिन्छ भन्ने वेबिनारबाट अथवा मेटेरियल्सहरुको थ्रुबाट हजुरहरुलाई के सजेसन छ, एडभाइस छ भने चाहिँ प्लिज फिडब्याक फर्म भर्दिनु होला, so that we can improve it more in coming days. Your feedbacks will be highly appreciated. अनि अर्को भनेको चाहिँ हाम्रो इभेन्ट साइन अप शीट छ. यो भनेको चाहिँ जस्तो हामीलाई एकदम रेगुलर धेरै जनाले चाहिँ यसमा यो हाम्रो नोटिफाइड गर्दिनु न इभेन्ट्सहरुको, वेबिनारहरुको भनेर धेरै नै इमेलहरु र इन्फर्मेसन सोधिराख्नुहुन्छ, सो दैट हामीले चाहिँ यो साइन अप शीट चाहिँ मेलिङ लिस्टको लागि बनाएका छौं. हजुरले यो साइन अप शीट भन्नुभयो भने चाहिँ हामीले चाहिँ हाम्रो रेगुलर एमएचआरएन को इभेन्टहरु जस्तै यो वेबिनारहरु र कुनै अनाउन्समेन्टहरु अनि अरु कुनै एक्टिभिटीजहरु हुँदा चाहिँ हामीले हजुरलाई रेगुलर नोटिफाइड गर्न सकिन्छ. जस्तो यो साइन अप शीट भएर चाहिँ हजुरहरु नेटवर्क मेम्बर्स हुने भन्ने चाहिँ हैन, त्यो हाम्रो सेपरेट कुरा हो. यसमा भन्नुभयो भने चाहिँ हामीले चाहिँ नोटिफाइड गर्छौं, सो दैट त्यसकारणले गर्दा चाहिँ जो नेटवर्क मेम्बर्स अलरेडी हुनुहुन्छ उहाँहरुले साइन अप शीट भर्नु पर्दैन. यो फर्महरु चाहिँ हामीले अहिले कमेन्ट बक्समा पनि राख्ने छौं, एन्ड अल्सो फिडब्याक फर्म र इभेन्ट साइन अप शीट चाहिँ हामीले इमेल मार्फत पनि पठाउने छौं. And the next thing is हाम्रो यो वेबिनार चाहिँ मन्थली वेबिनार चाहिँ द थर्ड वीक अफ एभ्री मन्थ हुँदै आइरहेको छ, एक्सेप्ट दशैं एन्ड तिहार ब्रेक और कुनै इयरली रिभ्यू भएको बेलामा. फर एक्जाम्पल हाम्रो जनवरीमा चाहिँ वेबिनार ब्रेक थियो फर द इयरली रिभ्यू. यो वेबिनारको लागि चाहिँ इमेल इन्भिटेसन्सहरु, क्यालेन्डर इन्भाइट्सहरु र डेट्स, स्पिकर डिटेल्स सब कुराहरु चाहिँ हामीले इमेल मार्फत सेन्ड गर्छौं, सो यु डु नट ह्याभ टु ट्र्याक इट. But if you have to update or gain some information related to it, हजुरहरुले चाहिँ हाम्रो सोशल मिडिया पेजेसहरुमा फलो गर्न सक्नुहुनेछ. or if you have any information or if you have missed the webinars from previous or need any forms or sign up sheets, हजुरहरुले डाइरेक्टली एमएचआरएन को अफिशियल इमेल एड्रेसमा मेल गर्न सक्नुहुनेछ. And before moving to us introducing our speaker, there are some things more about the webinars, which is the structure of webinar. हाम्रो वेबिनारको स्ट्रक्चरमा चाहिँ हाम्रो इन्ट्रोडक्सन र स्पिकरको इन्ट्रोडक्सनमा सर्टेन टाइम र त्यसपछि हाम्रो प्रेजेन्टेसन हुन्छ, जसमा चाहिँ हाम्रो स्पिकरले चाहिँ सर्टेन टाइम आफ्नो प्रेजेन्टेसन दिनुहुन्छ with the help of slides. त्यो प्रेजेन्टेसनमा चाहिँ we do not interrupt our speaker, instead we ask questions in the Q&A sessions right after the presentations. हाम्रो Q&A session and discussion session हुन्छ. त्यसमा चाहिँ हजुरहरुले आफ्नो ह्यान्ड रेज गरेर जुम एपमा आफ्नो क्वेशन्सहरु टर्न बाइ टर्न राख्न सक्नुहुनेछ और कमेन्ट बक्समा आफ्नो क्वेशन राख्न सक्नुहुनेछ, which would be more organized. त्यसपछि हाम्रो ब्रेकआउट सेसन हुन्छ. ब्रेकआउट सेसनमा चाहिँ हामीले चाहिँ हजुरहरुलाई सर्टेन ग्रुपमा डिभाइड गरेर चाहिँ हाम्रो स्पिकरले प्रोभाइड गर्नुहुनेछ क्वेसनहरू त्यो डिस्कसन्स क्वेसन हुन्छ त्यो चाहिँ हामीले हजुरहरूलाई प्रोभाइड गरेर चाहिँ हामी डिफ्रेन्ट ग्रुपमा डिस्कस गरेर चाहिँ त्यसको समरी चाहिँ लास्टमा एकजना मोडरेटरले सेयर गर्छौँ जस्तो कोमोडरेसनमा हाम्रो एकजना ग्रुपमा स्पिकर बस्नुहुनेछ एउटा ग्रुपमा म बस्नेछु र एउटा ग्रुपमा हाम्रो रितिका सिंह म्याम हुनुहुन्छ हु इज रिसर्च कन्सल्टेन्ट अफ जर्ज वासिङटन युनिभर्सिटी सी विल बी देयर सो आफ्टर द्याट विल ऱ्याप अप द वेबिनार. So now for the introduction of speaker Dr. Rishabh Koirala, I would like to request Ritika Singh ma'am for that. Ritika ma'am.
Thank you, Vinitaji, for handing over this part of moderation to me. Dr. Brandon Court, who's a professor at George Washington University, Leche, Dr. Rishabh Koirala introduce garnuncha. Dr. Brandon, please.
Sabaijanalai namaste. I'm very excited to have the opportunity to introduce Dr. Rishabh Koirala. Before I go into his formal bio, I just want to say what a pleasure it is to have Dr. Rishabh joining us. I've known him for a number of years, and he's always been great at challenging the status quo and thinking outside the box. And I think we need many, many more psychiatrists like Dr. Rishabh in Nepal and around the world. If any of you are interested, there's a Los Angeles Times op-ed written about Dr. Rishabh by an anthropologist here at George Washington. And he's also featured in a recent book about stigma reduction called Nobody's Normal. So his work has been widely recognized. In particular, and I'll mention his bio in a second, Dr. Rishabh also contributed to the recent DSM, or Diagnostic and Statistical Manual. Thanks, Tony, for popping that into the chat there. Everybody can check out in the chat the article about Dr. Rishabh in the LA Times. But so in terms of the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, they've been trying to revise it recently to be more culturally appropriate and culturally contextualized. And so Dr. Rishabh made some major contributions specifically to the trauma and stress-related disorders section. So he's featured as one of the contributing authors of the DSM-5 text revision. So in terms of his formal bio, Dr. Koirala is a consultant psychiatrist and researcher who did his post-graduation in psychiatry from the Institute of Medicine, TUTH, Nepal, and his PhD on trauma-related disorders from the University of Oslo in Norway. His research work is mainly based on trauma-related disorders, both PTSD and complex PTSD, which may be new for many of you and you'll hear more about today. Traditional healing and mental illness, biological markers such as cytokines, and psycho-oncology, which is the intersection of mental health and cancer studies. He's published several research articles in more than a dozen international peer-reviewed journals and has contributed in several books, including, as I just mentioned, the American Psychiatric Association's DSM-5 text revision. He was also the focal person for the WHO on mental health in Nepal at the time of the 2015 earthquakes and led a lot of the massive rollout of mental health services after the earthquake. So a big thanks to his contribution at that important time. He also established the first psycho-oncology clinic of Nepal and has a special interest in community psychiatry, addiction psychiatry, adult ADHD, and personality disorders, as well as a passion for Scandinavian death metal, but I think that'll be a different talk in the future. Thanks so much for joining us today, Dr. Rishabh. I'm going to turn it over to you, and my apologies, I'm going to have to leave early for another meeting, but we really, really appreciate your time and look forward to your discussion. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you, Brandon. For such a wonderful...
Thank you so much, Dr. Brandon. I interrupt. And now, just a reminder, you have 15 minutes at most for the presentations. Then after, we have 15 minutes for question and answer sessions and 15 minutes for breakout sessions. And the floor is yours, Dr. Rishabh.
Thank you. I think I haven't given the right to share the screen. Please do that. Yeah, now I got it. Just a minute. I need to make some changes. Sorry for the delay.
Is there any problem, Dr. Risa?
No. Just give me a second. Yeah. Is it clear?
Yes, it is.
Okay. Hello, everyone. Today I'll be presenting on a portion of my PhD research, and the presentation's topic, as mentioned earlier, is Are trauma-related disorders rare in Nepal? An exploration of PTSD and complex PTSD in trauma victims presenting in psychiatry OPD, tertiary center of Nepal. My overview of the whole presentation is this. And to talk about the background, trauma, and Nepal, we'll start with some events that influence the people of Nepal. And the first was the Maoist insurgency that lasted from 1996 to 2006. And the second was the earthquake of 2015. And these two events took life of thousands of people and destroyed hundreds of thousands of households. And these were the major traumas that the people suffered in last few decades. And it has been seen that such kind of trauma leads to several disorders, namely acute stress reaction disorder, adjustment disorder, prolonged disorder, post-traumatic stress disorder, and complex PTSD, along with other mental illnesses. So these kind of I studied post-traumatic disorder, post-traumatic stress disorder, as well as complex PTSD in my research. And to give you a brief overview about post-traumatic stress disorder, it is a disorder or syndrome that occurs after an exposure of an event which is very threatening or horrific in nature. And the main characteristic symptoms of this disorder is one being re-experiencing the event as occurring as in here and now. This statement was introduced in DSM-5, here and now. The IC-11 also has this thing. The person has to experience it as it's occurring again and again. And it may occur in the form of flashbacks and nightmares. The second important point is avoidance. There is deliberate avoidance of reminders that produce re-experiencing of that event. And the reminders may be, the avoidance may be internal in the form of thought, avoiding the thought of that event, or external, like avoiding cues, people, or places that remind the person of the event. And finally, the third point is a persistent perception of hidden current threat, where the person has startling hypervigilance to even minor stimuli. So these symptoms express the symptoms of PTSD. But what has been seen is that some individuals who were subjected to trauma, especially prolonged and repetitive trauma, they had this kind of symptoms, but the symptoms were more than this. And when explored, a new diagnostic entity was introduced in ICD-11, and it is still not formally included in DSM-5, though it has been mentioned. So this new entity includes symptoms of PTSD along with severe and pervasive problems in emotional regulation. That means the person has heightened emotional reactivity to minor stressors, violent outbursts. They might have reckless or self-destructive behavior, dissociative symptoms, and even emotional numbing too. And along with that symptom, behavioral symptom, they have persistent negative beliefs about themselves. They think themselves as worthless, or they have a very low opinion about themselves. And third, they have difficulty in sustaining relationships. So this defines the complex PTSD, the new entity. Now, with this background, if we explore the past research done in Nepal, there are a lot of research done in trauma and related disorders in Nepal. And it has been done by Nepali as well as foreign researchers. And it has also been seen a wide range of PTSD among the trauma-affected population, and the range ranges from 8.5% to 59.7%, and even in general population to this is a higher rate. 9.6% have been seen to have PTSD. So, despite this, despite having such a high percentage of PTSD seen in research, in clinical practice, we don't see a lot of diagnosis of trauma-related disorders being made. And to talk about complex PTSD, there are no studies being done except for this one in Nepal, and even in South Asia also. In my understanding, until this research was published, there were no other studies done in complex PTSD. So with this problem, if despite having so much prevalence of PTSD according to research, low diagnosis in clinical settings, what we did was we planned the research with an objective of to examine rate of PTSD and complex PTSD in trauma-affected patients coming to psychiatry OPD. We also studied childhood trauma in relation with complex PTSD, and we tried also to see if PTSD, complex PTSD, had lower quality of life than those without complex PTSD. And we had several other objectives in the whole research, but this is the points that I'm going to discuss, the results I'm going to discuss later. In materials and methodology, it was a cross-sectional observational study with convenient sampling, and we took our participants from psychiatric OPD, Institute of Medicine, TUTH, and they had the inclusion criteria was an experience of trauma at least 1 month back to rule out acute stress reaction or disorder. And it was the trauma as described by ICD-10 PTSD section, and age group was 18 to 60 years. We excluded any major neurological or psychiatric illnesses from the patients. Now, in interview procedure, written consent was done, and it was, as I mentioned earlier, that we collected a lot of data, and it was 2 hours long interview with blood sample collection on the next day, and the duration of data collection was 1st April 2017 to 14th August 2018. In total, we collected 102 participants, among which 2 were excluded due to age range. And for these results, we had used socio-demographic questionnaire that we had made ourselves, Kupasamy socioeconomic scale, WMH-CD version 2.1, section K for lifetime PTSD. We used PCLC for current PTSD, sites for complex PTSD, childhood trauma questionnaire, and WHO quality of life brief. Now, in results, in socio-demographic profile, I won't go into deep. I just wanted to show that the male and female ratio were almost similar. It was almost evenly distributed. And characteristic of trauma, interestingly, the median was 2. That means on an average, they had 2 major traumatic events in their life, and natural disaster, which were included earthquake, that was the most common type of trauma. 84% had experienced that. And among the most traumatizing event, they regarded rape as the most traumatizing event, with all the participants saying that 100% participants saying that it was the most traumatizing event. And we also categorized, we wanted to see if we categorized trauma into 2 groups, one simple trauma and another repetitive trauma. And in simple trauma, we included those trauma which occurred only once, and repetitive trauma in traumas which repeatedly occurred. So that way we divided the trauma type. And if we see the results, we got very high rates of PTSD. Lifetime PTSD was 83% among the participants, and 16% had current PTSD during the time of study. And among those who had lifetime PTSD, we saw that 42 among 83 people, that is 50.6%, had complex PTSD. And complex PTSD was associated with female gender and lower quality of life in 4 domains, all the 4 domains of quality of life. And interestingly, it was not associated with childhood trauma. And these are questions that can be raised. Why so high rates of PTSD and complex PTSD? Why no relation with childhood trauma? We can have the discussion later. And when we compared, we saw that current PTSD, both PTSD as well as complex PTSD, were highly comorbid with depression as well as anxiety disorder. But complex PTSD was more associated with depression and anxiety. This also shows that the gravity of complex PTSD in comparison to PTSD. And this is also an interesting finding in a way that most of the patients, they tend to diagnose depression and anxiety and they leave out exploring PTSD. Therefore, most of the patients who come for consultation, they do not get the diagnosis of trauma-related disorders because their diagnosis ends with depression and anxiety. And now to just give you an overall view about the project, our study project was named as SWOT study of health outcome of trauma. It was a multinational study occurring both in Kathmandu and in Oslo. And apart from PTSD and complex PTSD, we have published data on depression, anxiety. There are still a lot of data on other anxiety disorders, pain disorder, addiction. And we also published an article on 6 cytokines. We evaluated the relation of 6 cytokines in comparison to trauma and PTSD. And further, we want to explore it in relation to complex PTSD. We also explored quality of life, resilience. And now coming to a methodological challenge, obviously such a big research. And for a new researcher like me, we did face a lot of methodological challenges. One interesting challenge was I used a lot of translated and validated questionnaires because in Nepal, there is a compulsion that we use translated questionnaires. But while using the translated questionnaires, I came across a lot of difficulties because there were questions inside the questionnaire which I was a little bit dissatisfied with the translation, but we had to use that, and that caused trouble during the interview because we could not explain it well to the participants. And another interesting point was we started the data collection for complex PTSD before ICD-11's diagnostic criteria for complex PTSD was devised or it was public. Due to that, we had problems during article writing, analysis, and finally, we could not write complex CPTSD diagnosis. Instead, we had to use complex PTSD caseness because the reviewer demanded that. And that was another methodological problem. And we also faced challenges in data collection. Another interesting portion was like, we use validated and translated child trauma questionnaire, and it was translated and validated several years back. At that time, scenario was different in Nepal, and at that time, sexual trauma was eliminated from the translation, citing the cultural difficulties while asking the question. So, but now things would have been different. I think if we could have provided a trusting and secure environment, we could have gathered that data, but since we used the old questionnaire, that portion was left from the CTQ, and probably that also created the biases in the result. And there were other real-time challenges. For example, getting ethical clearances. It took 4 months for us to collect the ethical clearance, collecting patients in OPD, and the OPD staff was quite hesitant to provide me the patient because he thought it was a hindrance to his daily work and to his patient flow. And later we had to make him happy in different ways to get the patient for the patient research. And I had also extracted DNA from the samples. We could not do the analysis for DNA because of funding problems. But since the samples were the property of University of Oslo, Norway, despite getting funding from one of the Asian team from US, we could not send it to US because Norwegians were hesitant to do that. They didn't want to sell their material, and at the end, the sample got wasted, sadly. And so in conclusion, I would like to say that our findings show that very high rates of complex PTSD and PTSD in patients seeking professional help. So that needs to be addressed. We should, I would like to suggest new researchers not to hesitate to explore new horizons, but they should also be aware to bite what they can chew. They should know the limitations of the research, how much they have to do there. And failure is another important integral part of research. So one example is my first paper got rejected by a journal, and later after rejection, I modified it, and it was published in a better journal with higher impact factor. So sometimes even the failure can be fruitful for you. And so being a researcher is more than doing a research. It teaches you persistence, it teaches you sincerity, and many other things. It makes you a better person if you are a good researcher. So with this, I would like to mention a few points that I missed during my whole research. One was research team, because I was working mostly from Nepal. It's very important to have a research team to encourage you during this boring and very tedious process. It's good to have really good expert guidance. During cytokine analysis and research, I had a lot of problems because I did not get good guidance. It was a new thing for me, my supervisor. And I mentioned earlier, we should understand our rejections, we should understand our limitation, and we should try to stick to the time, because I took quite long to complete my PhD. With this, I would like to end my presentation, and thank you for your patient listening.
Thank you so much, Dr. Risa, for the great presentations. So everyone, you can raise your hand in the Zoom app for the questions or any confusions you want to ask to Dr. Risa, and also you can input it in the comment box. And I would like to request Ritika ma'am to handle the questions and answers session.
Thank you, Vinitaji, for your awesome moderation of the first half of the webinar. Thank you, Dr. Rishabh, for an extraordinarily interesting and illuminating presentation. I know that हाम्रो साथीहरुलाई एकदम धेरै क्वेशन्सहरु मनमा आइसकेको छ. I already see एउटा question. म त्यो सोध्दै गर्छु. तपाईहरुलाई क्वेशन सोध्नु छ भने अगेन विनिताजीले भनिसक्नुभयो, प्लिज कि त च्याट बक्समा हाल्दिनु होला, नभए हात रेज गरेर डाइरेक्टली डाक्टर ऋषभलाई सोध्दा पनि हुन्छ. एउटा क्वेशन. Thank you for the wonderful presentation and congratulations for the much needed research in trauma and related disorders. Why wasn't DSM-5 used and instead ICD-10 taken as the reference? Were the tools used in the study based on ICD-10 criteria for PTSD? Dr. Rishabh, please.
Yes, that was another issue, because what we are in Nepal doing research, we have to face a lot of difficulties. And I think one of the major difficulties is finding good questionnaire, validated and compatible questionnaire for our culture. And we don't, to get CD was used because it was validated for ICD-10. Therefore, we had, for DSM-5, I did try to use MINI. It was not translated and validated. MINI, I had a lot of difficulties. I initially tried to take permission for MINI. First thing is MINI charges money. Second thing, it was not validated and translated. There were a lot of difficulties, so I had to drop that thing. And later on, MINI is currently validated, but that was quite a few years later before I started submitted my proposal. That was the main reason.
Thank you, Dr. Rishabh. Arko question आइसकेको छ. Kapil Belbase, what's your view on combat-related PTSD in Nepal?
Yes, PTSD, the concept of PTSD was came out from the whole war scene. It was, I think, it was for initial Thomas cell shock syndrome initially. So as a whole, PTSD included even my research included combat related PTSD in the terms of my there were participants who had gone through Maoist insurgency and civil war, who had gone through those combat. So these data also represent those people too. Yes.
Thank you. We have 2 more questions. Will you the rate of questions coming in is making it difficult for me to keep up, Dr. Rishabh. Will you please mention any therapy modules that we can use for the purpose of psychosocial counseling?
Yeah, sadly, there are not many things like therapies that I know that has been specifically done for trauma center. Trauma center CBT is one of the most recommended one. Another is EMDR. EMDR, though very widely used, I can't say that it is the gold standard. Because there are plus and minus points against it. But rather than having nothing, I think I would also suggest EMDR. There were a few sessions of EMDR training being done in Nepal even after earthquake from some of the team from UK did that. But I don't know if specifically trauma-based CBT or EMDR is regularly practiced over here, but those are the recommended ones. But even without that, I would recommend those people visiting psychologists who are clinical psychologists to do those kind of at least CBT. That will be helpful, even if not specifically directed towards trauma.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Rishabh. We can take a couple of more questions and then we will have to move on to our breakout rooms. A question from Hillary. I was wondering if you could speak a little more to the work on biomarkers of trauma PTSD. No cytokines are typically markers of inflammation, but I didn't know if you could give a little more info.
Yeah, I think Ritika and we talked about it, that we could make a whole presentation related to biomarkers and PTSD. That was one of the big chunk of my research. But to tell you in short, there's a lot. There's a lot that can be explored, but I did explore complex PTSD with biomarkers, and did find some social findings, but there are a lot of things. Cytokines are very notorious in the sense that they are that like a lot of things affect them, and their regulation is influenced by even the time of day, the ethnicity, taking like food, whether you have taken food or not, even simple inflammations. So it's quite tough to say find out cytokines. A lot of research has been done, though we showed some positive results. Still, we cannot say that they will be the best biomarkers for any mental disorder, in my experience. And we need to explore more. There are still other like biomarkers that has been explored. Yes.
Thank you, Dr. Rishabh. There is another question. Did you analyze the symptomatology PTSD versus cytokine levels? What was the result? Relationship between trauma and serum cytokine levels?
Relation between trauma and serum. Yeah, trauma also has shown to be related with changes in cytokines. One of the cytokine, interleukin-6, did show a relation between trauma and the level of cytokines. So there are other cytokines which have shown positive relation with trauma also. So that is another important factor that influences the relation between PTSD, trauma, and cytokine, because these three things are related.
Another one question. Are symptoms different for patients with trauma due to family members suffering from severe trauma?
Yeah. Now the thing is, kindly repeat the question. Are
of course
symptoms? Yeah, I read it.
Symptoms different
symptoms
for patients.
See, this is a very interesting thing. How do we perceive trauma? That was one of my main question. Trauma is also relative trauma. Like for example, a person who has suffered. If we take example of two people who lost their home during earthquake, then one might see it as a thing that occurred in their life and they want to overcome it. The person might think, I'll build a bigger house than this. While the same a person who is suffering through the same traumatic event another person might say that, oh, I lost everything in my life, and he or she might feel hopeless about it. So even trauma is a related trauma. So that is another challenge that we have to see, because we cannot just say that exact same trauma brings different symptoms in different person. But yes, devastating and trauma, very horrific trauma, does bring change in a larger group of people than simple trauma, and it also depends upon psychology of the person.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Rishabh. One of the questions is very similar to our discussion questions, so I will make sure that you are in the breakout room with Dr. Rishabh to discuss this further. One last question that we have time for. Were you able to look into what aspects of childhood trauma were more significantly associated with PTSD or CPTSD? And can you please talk a little more about how you're incorporating resilience into your study project? So first is, what aspect of childhood trauma were more significantly associated with PTSD or CPTSD?
We explored, the thing is there, one is neglect, another is direct abuse. And among neglect and abuse also, there were three different factors. One is sexual abuse, another was verbal, another one was physical abuse. So we did not differentiate between, now, as I mentioned earlier, sexual abuse, that portion was totally excluded. That was a sad part because of culture. We cited cultural issues, but later on I regret that, because I think that's the learning that we get from it and doing research. We tend to improve with each research, and we did not find any relation. And the major reason could be that we excluded sexual abuse from the whole thing, and that decreased the values of the whole neglect and abuse section. So I would say I'm not happy with the results in that portion, and I would say newer research exploring and doing it more in a sensitive way would probably give us a better result, because it has been seen that complex PTSD is related to childhood sexual abuse. Yeah.
Thank you, Dr. Rishabh. One last question, because it's already there. This Pachicha will go into our breakout rooms. Traditional healers को चाहिँ role कस्तो देख्यो होला? Research objective मा त्यो थिएन होला, तैपनि त्यसको बारे केही बताइदिन सक्नुहुन्छ?
होइन, त्यो पनि यस्तो, the thing is, I'm replying in English because I see few of the English-speaking participants also. But that is another interesting thing. That sadly I incorporated that question in middle of my research. Just one question to explore it more by myself. But most of the people, I have no correlations. I've not done any analysis. But most of the people, they do go to traditional healers. We have done Tony. Being the main researcher, we have like Brandon and Tony and a few other members, like other researchers. We have worked on traditional healing, and we have found a lot of things. And we have seen that it's a valuable component that should not be excluded, and that should be it's kind of is with two sword with two edges. Like if we use it in very rational, good way, it can be helpful for the mental health of the people living in Nepal who have faith on those traditional healers. But if it is misused, then even traditional healing can be misused, as we have seen and read in newspapers. So I think this is a good portion that needs to be channelized in a good way and included in mental health positivity. I hope you get what I'm trying to say. Yeah.
Great. Thank you so much, Dr. Rishabh. I echo everybody in saying that this has been a very engaging question answer session. Now we are ready to go hamro breakout rooms. We're ready to go into our breakout rooms. The breakout room is an opportunity for us to discuss better the discussion questions that Dr. Rishabh has handpicked and selected for us. Dr. Rishabh, let's try and focus on two questions for now. The general questions. Though the importance to do research is increasing in Nepal, what do you think still lacks here? Is the first question. And the second is, with hundreds of times more research done in West and developed countries, what is the value of research done here in developing countries like Nepal? And does it have any significance for the developing countries? So we'll all go to our individual breakout rooms, and we have around 10 to 15 people in our breakout rooms. It will be, the breakout rooms will close after 12 minutes. So please make sure that your discussions are done by then, after which we'll come back to the central room and just have a 1-minute explanation of the discussions in our room. So Binita ji is the co-moderator in one room, I am in the other, and Dr. Rishabh, you're the co-moderator of the third room. So I'm opening the breakout rooms now. Enjoy, everybody. Hello.
बोल्दा बोल्दै रोकिहाल्यो राम्रो डिस्कसन भइरहेको थियो सो समरीको लागि म नै पहिला गरौँ है सो विदाउट लसिङ टाइम सो हाम्रो ग्रुपमा चाहिँ 11 जना थियौं जसमा चाहिँ फर्स्ट क्वेशनमा चाहिँ दो द इम्पोर्टेन्स टु द रिसर्च इज इन्क्रिजिङ इन नेपाल व्हाट डु यु थिंक स्टिल ल्याक्स हियर मा चाहिँ एकदम कमन हाम्रो डिस्कसन भनेको चाहिँ इनफ गाइडेन्स लाइक mentorship, where should we go for answers or guidance भन्ने कुरा चाहिँ त्यो ल्याक छ हाम्रो कन्ट्रीमा जति रिसर्च भए पनि अनि त्यसपछि एथिक्सको कुराहरू भ्यालिडिटीको कुराहरू चाहिँ अर्गनाइज अथवा एथिक्स प्रपरली फलो गरेको हुँदैन जसले गर्दा चाहिँ रिसर्च भए पनि यो कुरा ल्याक भएर चाहिँ त्यो अलिकति फ्रुटफुल नहुने पनि हुन्छ सो फन्डिङको कुराहरू ल कन्फिडेन्सको कुराहरू भयो जस्तो लाइक in academics also we do not get support and encouragement in any innovative idea and they do not get focus or give more attention to innovative ideas and networking medium is very low so these things still lacks here in Nepal so the importance to the research is increasing so the next question ma chahi hamro already discussion bhayeko थियो बाहिर हन्ड्रेड्स अफ रिसर्च भए पनि हाम्रो नेपालमा सिग्निफिकेन्स भनेको चाहिँ जस्तो हाम्रो बाहिर कन्टेक्स्ट अनुसार भइसके पनि हाम्रो नेपालको कन्टेक्स्ट अनुसार चाहिँ ग्रास लेभलमा एभ्री रिसर्च इज मोस्ट इम्पोर्टेन्ट एकदम जेनरल रूपमा हेर्दा चाहिँ सो यसमा चाहिँ जस्तो हाम्रो अथरहरू हाम्रो नेपालको जस्तो लेक्चर प्रोफेसरहरू जो रिसर्च गरिराख्नु भएको छ एक्टिभली उहाँहरूको कन्ट्रिब्युसन अनि त्यसपछि इन्टरनेसनल रिकग्निसनको कुरा अथरसिप कुराहरू चाहिँ इन्क्रिज भइरहेको छ जसले गर्दा नेसनल लेभलमा अथवा सबैलाई चाहिँ अलिकति मोटिभेट गर्ने कुराहरू चाहिँ सिग्निफिकेन्ट नै भयो त्यसपछि हाम्रो कन्टेक्स्टको हिसाबमा चाहिँ जस्तो रिजल्ट्सहरू चाहिँ उहाँको भन्दा फरक यहाँ आएर अथवा कुनै बेटर आएर पनि त्यसले गर्दा रिसर्च अझै राम्रो हुन्छ यस्तो खालको रिसर्चले गर्दा चाहिँ अझै इन्फर्मेसन डिसेमिनेट हुन्छ र रिसर्चमा अझै बेटर हुन्छ प्रोग्रेस भन्ने चाहिँ हाम्रो डिस्कसन भयो यसमा त्यसपछि यति नै हो थ्यांक यू रितिका म्याम यु क्यान चाहिँ
Okay, thank you, Binita ji. Hamrochi, we focused mostly on the second question only. Hamroma 14 jana ekdam participatory mancheharu hunuhuन्थ्यो. So second question ma, why do we still need such research? Hamro developing countries ma we had a lot of really strong points. Some of which are West ma, no matter how much research is there, one of the major things we want to do with research is inform policy. Ani त्यो policy making चाहिँ हरेक देशमा फरक हुन्छ. The structure is different, doctor-patient relationship is different, public health needs are different. So त्यसले गर्दाखेरि contextual importance त एकदमै छ नै छ. साथसाथै हरेक देशको socio-economic markers of trauma, socio-economic markers of disease र socio-economic ways of treating people पनि फरक हुने कारणले गर्दाखेरि चाहिँ there is an increased need of contextual relevance of research in developing countries भनेर आयो. साथसाथै यसकोबाट चाहिँ under diagnosis हुने over diagnosis हुने कुनै पनि देशमा chances धेरै हुन्छ if we are able to adapt research but not properly. त्यो एउटा challenge छ. भन्दा भन्दै हाम्रो discussion चाहिँ एकदमै नै how do we really translate research findings into practice भनेर पनि गयो. I have encouraged everybody to please join हाम्रो Twitter groups so that we can engage further in these questions which need a lot more engagement for sure. Dr. Rishabh, तपाईको summary भनिदिनुस् न.
हाम्रोमा चाहिँ लगभग दुईटा क्वेशनलाई एउटै लगभग गाँसियो. हाम्रोमा चाहिँ के छ भन्दा एउटा डिसेमिनेसनको कुराहरू आयो. डिसेमिनेसन एकदम जरुरी छ. रिसर्च त कन्डक्ट भयो तर त्यो रिसर्चको चाहिँ आउटपुट न क्लिनिकल प्र्याक्टिसमा राम्ररी गयो जति हुने पर्ने त्यो भइरहेको छैन अनि न पोलिसीमा पनि त्यो लेभलमा गएको छैन र फाइनली पब्लिकमा पनि गएको छैन र मिडियाको ठुलो रोल छ. मिडिया मात्र होइन रिसर्चर प्लस मिडिया दुवैको म्युचुअल रोल छ किनभने जेनरल पपुलेसनले पनि बुझ्नु पर्यो समस्या के हो भनेर. जेनरल पपुलेसन थाहा पायो भने पो उनीहरू आफै एक्सप्लोर गर्दा स्टिङमा पर्छ. अर्को कुरा चाहिँ के थियो भन्दाखेरि सौहाद्रले एड अन गर्छ कि हेलो सौहाद्र.
हजुर तपाईले गरिसक्नुभयो मेजर कुराहरू तर भन्नुभएको जस्तै हामीले गरेको रिसर्च हरू चाहिँ हाउ इट इज गेटिङ ट्रान्सलेटेड जुन चाहिँ सबैजनाले चाहिँ राम्रोसँग बुझ्न सकौँ भन्ने कुराहरू अनि सबैजना भन्दाले पोलिसी लेभलमा प्लस प्र्याक्टिसनर्सहरूको कुराहरू पनि सो त्यो एउटा कुरा आयो अनि अर्को चाहिँ हाम्रो मिडियाको साथी पनि हुनुहुन्थ्यो अनि उहाँलाई चाहिँ हामीले चाहिँ हामी भन्दाखेरि चाहिँ टकिङ अबाउट पब्लिक हेल्थ रिसर्चर्सहरू रिसर्च फाइन्डिङ्सहरू चाहिँ कसरी चाहिँ उहाँहरूलाई अपडेट गराउने अनि उहाँसँग चाहिँ धेरै पावर हुन्छ जेनरल पब्लिकदेखि लिएर चाहिँ पोलिसी मेकरसम्म पुग्ने कुराहरूमा सो त्यो पनि गर्नु चाहिँ नेसेसरी भनेर चाहिँ देखियो अनि गुड थिङ चाहिँ वी मेड अ गुड कनेक्सन त्यति हो
Okay, we are running out of time. हाम्रो मेस बक्समा चाहिँ यहाँ साइन अप सिट र फिडब्याक फर्म रितिका म्यामले राखिदिइसक्नु भएको छ प्लिज यो फर्म भरिदिनु होला हामीले इमेल मार्फत पनि सेन्ड गर्नेछौँ रेजिस्टर गर्नु भएको छैन भने प्लिज रेजिस्टर गरिदिनु होला हामीलाई मेटेरियल्सहरू सेन्ड गर्न सजिलो हुन्छ एन्ड थ्याङ्क यू सो मच डक्टर रिसभ it was really great presentations and really effective. And thank you so much, Ritika ma'am, Sawartha sir, and thank you so much everyone for actively participating in this webinar. We had a great discussion. See you in the next webinar. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you everyone
Thank you,
for
Dr.
patiently
Rishabh.
listening. Thank you
so much. Thank you. Thank you, Vintaji. Thank you, everybody. Dr. Rishabh, ekdamai ramro bhayo. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.